in the 1840s, a strange fire pattern began to appear across Europe and America. Not one archive burned alone, but many, as if someone had erased memory on purpose. Court records vanished, parish books turned to ash, and city archives disappeared in sudden blazes. To officials, the timing looked less like accident and more like coordination. These were not just dusty papers. They were birth records, land claims, tax rolls, and legal proof, the paper skeleton of entire societies. And once they were gone, people could lose property, identity, inheritance, even citizenship. A burned ledger could make a family legally disappear overnight. So why did so many record offices burn at once? That question opens a far stranger story than simple bad luck or careless lamps. To understand it, we have to step into a world built on paper. In the 1840s, governments were growing fast, and archives were multiplying everywhere. Every tax payment, every property transfer, every court decision had to be copied by hand. A single office could hold the legal truth of thousands of lives. That made records powerful. It also made them vulnerable. If one archive disappeared, entire communities could be thrown into legal chaos. Then came the fires. Some broke out in basements, others in municipal buildings, and a few in places guarded as if they mattered most. Officials wrote some off as accidents, but the clustering of these blazes made suspicion impossible to ignore, especially when several happened in the same decade. The mystery deepened because the destruction seemed selective. Not every building burned, only the ones holding the most valuable written proof. That detail mattered. A random blaze destroys wood and paper, a deliberate one destroys evidence. And evidence is exactly what archives were built to preserve. And in the 1840s, Europe was changing fast. Revolutions were brewing, empires were nervous, and governments had reasons to fear what records could reveal. A record office did more than store documents. It stored power, secrets, and proof of ownership. Burn it, and you can rewrite yesterday. That is why these fires feel so unsettling. They did not merely destroy property, they struck at the machinery of truth itself. Soon, whispers spread among officials and historians. Were these fires a coincidence, a cover-up, or part of a much larger political cleanup? There is no single answer yet, and that uncertainty is part of the story. But the pattern is real, and the pattern points somewhere disturbing. Because once you start tracing the burn sites, you notice something else. Many happened where fragile local history was stored, not where ordinary paperwork sat. That means the target was memory itself. Names, boundaries, debts, and rights all lived in those pages, and someone understood their value. And if memory can be destroyed, then history becomes negotiable. That is the nightmare hidden inside every archive fire. In the next part, we will follow the paper trail deeper into the governments, reforms, and suspicious coincidences that surrounded these flames. We will also see why some losses were never fully recorded, and how silence in the archives can be as revealing as the documents themselves. For now, the evidence is a trail of smoke, missing ledgers, and governments suddenly on edge. That is where the real investigation begins. And the deeper we go, the less these fires look like isolated disasters. They begin to look like a historical operation with a purpose. In Part 2, we will trace that operation step by step and see whether the 1840s really witnessed a great reset of record, power, and control. By the 1840s, governments had become paper empires. Every deed, tax roll, and court file lived in one place, making record rooms the true nerve centers of power. That is why the sudden wave of fires mattered so much. When archives burned, identities, debts, land titles, and authority could vanish in minutes. In city after city, the same pattern appeared, a blaze in the record office, and then confusion over who owned what, who owed what, and who ruled what. Officials called many of them accidents, but the timing was suspicious. Some fires erupted just as inspections, disputes, or legal challenges were closing in. To understand the operation, you have to see how records were stored. One fire in the right room could erase decades of paperwork and legal memory. Paper was not just storage, it was proof. Without it, a claim could be challenged, delayed, or quietly buried beneath bureaucracy. That made the 1840s especially volatile. A single blaze was no longer merely a local disaster, but a political weapon with lasting consequences. In Britain and beyond, reform was pushing old systems apart. New laws demanded cleaner administration, but the old paper towers had not been built for that pressure. That pressure created enemies. Anyone with a vested interest in old privileges had reason to welcome chaos, especially when records could no longer speak for themselves. Some investigators later noticed how selective the destruction seemed. Not every building burned, only the ones that held the most inconvenient paper trail. That is where the mystery deepens. If the goal was only chaos, the fires were enough. If the goal was control, the missing documents were the real prize. This is why the phrase, "record office matters." These were not dusty side rooms, they were the storage vaults of law, taxation, and state memory. Once a fire reached that vault, it was not just paper that disappeared. Entire chains of accountability could be severed, one page at a time. Modern readers often miss that detail. In the 1840s, an erased ledger could be as powerful as a forged signature and far harder to prove. That is why rumors spread so quickly. People understood that a destroyed archive could rewrite reality, not just hide a mistake. And in several places, the fires seemed to arrive after disputes over property, inheritance, or municipal authority had reached a breaking point. That sequence matters. First comes the conflict, then the fire, and finally a blank space where records used to settle the argument. Local newspapers sometimes reported the flames as isolated events, but once mapped together, the incidents start looking like a system, not an accident. Some archives were rebuilt, but the damage was permanent. Reconstructing what was lost meant relying on memory, copies, and political convenience. That is the quiet victory of destruction. The official version survives. What vanished in the flames can never fully answer back, and that is why the 1840s fires still matter. They reveal how power can hide inside ordinary paperwork, until the paperwork is gone. The real question is not whether every fire was deliberate, it is who benefited each time a record office turned to ash. Because once you ask that, the story changes. The fires stop looking random and the 1840s begin to look managed. In the next part, we follow the paper trail into the institutions themselves, where archive destruction begins to look like administrative strategy. And when we do, the question becomes unavoidable. Were these fires a scattered disaster or the opening move of a much larger reset? To understand the fires, we have to leave the flames for a moment and enter the paper world they erased. In the 1840s, governments ran on ledgers, deeds, and registry rooms. If those records vanished, ownership itself became slippery. Land boundaries, tax claims, inheritance, and even legal identity could be rewritten by whoever survived the fire. That is why the pattern matters. These were not random sheds or candle accidents. They struck the exact rooms where society stored proof of who owned what. And once you look at the victims of these fires, a strange hierarchy appears. The lost papers were not equal. Some belonged to nobles, others to merchants, officials, and old estates. That raises a darker possibility. Perhaps the fires were not meant to destroy memory, but to control it. In a paper-based state, destruction could function like editing. In many cities, the record offices were cramped, fire-prone, and badly lit. One spark in a crowded paper room could erase generations of legal history in minutes. Yet what makes this decade unusual is timing. Fires appear again and again across different offices, almost like the same invisible hand was moving through the system. That repetition matters because institutions usually learn from disasters. Here, however, the same vulnerable archive architecture kept appearing, as if prevention was never the goal. Even when officials investigated, their language was strangely limited. They described accidents, but the outcomes looked political: missing titles, disputed estates, and broken chains of proof. And that is the trap. A fire can look ordinary from outside while accomplishing extraordinary legal work inside. When archives burn, the archive itself becomes the witness. Think about who benefited. A destroyed registry could free an owner from debts, complicate a tenant's claim, or bury an embarrassing transfer from years before. That is why some historians treat these fires as administrative cleansing. Not merely destruction for its own sake, but a way to erase obligations that paper had made permanent. But the deeper you look, the stranger the geography becomes. These fires do not cluster only in one capital or one empire. They spread through different jurisdictions. That suggests either a shared vulnerability or a shared motive. And once motive enters the picture, the fires stop being simple tragedies and become evidence. In some places, the destruction was selective. Not every shelf vanished. Only the records with the highest administrative value, the ones that could settle power disputes. That selectivity is difficult to ignore. Wildfires do not usually spare the inconvenient ledger and target the crucial one, but human hands can do exactly that. And here the story widens again. Because the 1840s were also a decade of bureaucratic consolidation, when states were trying to gather, standardize, and reorder old claims. That effort made archives more important, not less. The more the state standardized land and law, the more dangerous a missing record became to the entire order. So ask yourself, if you wanted to reshape a society without announcing a revolution, where would you begin? You would begin with the paper that proves reality. That is why these fires feel less like isolated events and more like a campaign against continuity itself. Destroy the archive, and yesterday loses its legal grip on today. And once continuity is gone, new claims arrive dressed as facts. A replacement registry can be built, but it will never confess what was removed to make room for it. That is the real mystery behind the 1840s burnings. Not whether fire occurred, but whether fire was the mechanism that made a legal transformation possible. The fires may have looked chaotic to the public, but chaos is often the perfect cover for selective reconstruction. In that sense, destruction and bureaucracy can be partners, and that partnership may be the key to the whole decade. The archive burned, the system adapted, and the people left behind a record of absence where certainty once lived. In the next part, we follow that absence into the courts and ministries that had to rebuild reality from ash, because once the records are gone, the real struggle begins. In the ministries, the first task was brutal. Decide which copies could still be trusted. Every claim, every boundary, every inheritance now had to be tested against scraps, memories, and witnesses. In many cities, the answer was to reopen justice in temporary rooms. Court sessions moved into borrowed halls where judges sat beneath cracked plaster and heard arguments with no paper trail behind them. That shift exposed a deeper problem. Without official ledgers, the state had to decide whose memory counted as evidence and whose silence would be treated as fraud. In property disputes, this was devastating. One family might hold a burned deed in one hand and a neighbor's sworn recollection in the other, while the court weighed both like equal ghosts. Land offices became battlegrounds of improvisation. Survey maps were copied by hand, boundaries were reconstructed from memory, and a single missing page could shift an entire district, and every reconstruction created winners and losers. If a clerk favored one witness over another, the line between recovery and corruption grew thin enough to disappear. This is why ministries rushed to centralize authority. A broken archive could not be allowed to remain local, so governments pulled surviving records into tighter control. But centralization brought its own danger. Once information moved behind fewer doors, a single political order could shape history more easily than before. Across Europe, burned offices also meant delayed taxes. When old account books vanished, governments could not know who owed what, and local economies entered a haze of suspicion. Merchants were dragged into the chaos too. Credit depended on paper, and when paper disappeared, loans stalled, partnerships cracked, and trust had to be renegotiated line by line. In some places, businessmen rebuilt from private copies and personal notebooks. Yet those private archives were never neutral. They preserved ambition as much as fact. That is why historians later treated every rescued fragment with caution. A copied line might preserve a truth, but it could also smuggle in a lie that no one could verify. Then came the legal appeals. Families who had lost deeds and merchants who had lost contracts flooded higher courts, hoping appellate judges would restore what ash had taken. Those appeals slowed everything down. Courts were forced to become reconstruction machines, comparing testimony, fragments, and precedent, instead of simply applying a surviving file, and every delay had consequences beyond the courtroom. If ownership stayed unresolved, mortgages, repairs, marriages, and inheritance all froze in place. In that vacuum, local notaries gained unusual power. They became the last guardians of continuity, even though their authority depended on the very paper culture now collapsing. Some cities responded by issuing public notices asking citizens to come forward with copies. It was a desperate invitation to turn private memory into a public archive. The problem was scale. Thousands of people might remember a transaction differently, and once those versions entered the record, the new archive became contested from the start. That is the hidden danger of record loss. The fire does not end history. It creates a second history, written by whoever survives long enough to rewrite it. Officials knew that, which is why they obsessed over certification marks and duplicate copies. A seal on a surviving page could mean the difference between certainty and chaos. Yet even seals could be forged, and even duplicates could be disputed. So every recovered document demanded context: who copied it, when, and under whose authority. That scrutiny made archives into living arguments. A paper was no longer just evidence of the past, it was a political weapon in the present. In that atmosphere, some governments quietly accepted uncertainty as normal. They preferred a workable fiction over an impossible hunt for absolute truth. And that compromise would shape future administrations. Once a state learns it can survive without complete records, it also learns how much power lies in absence. So the ashes were never just ashes. They became the foundation for a new kind of authority, one built not on what survived, but on what could be convincingly rebuilt. And that is where the real story begins. Because once the ashes settled, the question was no longer what was lost, but who would decide what was remembered. By the 1840s, record offices were not sleepy archives. They were the machinery of property, inheritance, taxes, and legitimacy, and they kept empires from slipping into chaos. So when these offices began burning almost at once, the loss felt less like an accident and more like a coordinated erasure. Too many fires landed on too many crucial papers, too neatly, too quickly. That timing matters. That time in a decade obsessed with reform, borders, and control, a destroyed archive could wipe away inconvenient claims, disputed titles, and entire chains of accountability in one stroke. And because most people trusted paperwork more than memory, fire became a devastating tool. If the ledger vanished, then the argument itself could vanish with it. That is why these fires were so chilling. They did not merely destroy documents, they attacked the very system that proved who owned land, who owed money, and who had power. And notice what came after. Not silence, but replacement. As old records disappeared, new official versions began to appear, cleaner, tidier, and easier to control. That is the quiet trick of archival destruction. It does not always create a void. Sometimes it creates a vacuum, others rush to fill with their own preferred truth. That is why the surviving witnesses mattered so much. A clerk, a tenant, a surveyor, anyone who remembered the shape of the missing document became a threat to the new order. Because a memory can do what a document no longer can, contradict the archive. And once contradiction enters the room, the official story is never quite secure again. So the fires were not just destructive, they were selective. They consumed the material that could challenge power, while leaving just enough behind to build a new paper reality. That is the deeper pattern hidden inside these events. Destruction was followed by reconstruction, and reconstruction was followed by claims that the new version had always been necessary. By then, the archive itself had become a battleground. Whoever controlled the copy controlled the past, and whoever controlled the past could govern the present with confidence. And that is why these fires still matter. They expose a world in which records were not passive objects, but weapons quietly aimed at ownership, memory, and truth. Once you see that, the pattern becomes difficult to unsee. The fires were not only about endings, they were about resetting the terms of what could be known afterward. That is the unsettling brilliance of it all. The record office burned, but the authority attached to its reconstruction survived, and that survival changed everything. In that sense, the ashes were not a finale. They were a handoff from a fragile archive to a more flexible system of authority built in its place. And once that handoff happened, the people who owned the new paperwork owned the argument. They could decide what had been destroyed, what had survived, and what had never existed. That is why the fires feel so modern, even now. They reveal an old lesson: when records disappear, power does not disappear with them. It simply changes hands. So the question is not merely who lit the match. The harder question is who benefited from the emptiness left behind, and who got to write the replacement story. Because replacement stories are powerful. They sound orderly, they calm suspicion, and they make destruction look like unfortunate necessity instead of strategic opportunity. And that is why the burnings were so useful. They turned absence into evidence, and evidence into leverage for those willing to shape the gap. In the end, the greatest loss was not paper. It was the ability to challenge the official version with something solid, specific, and surviving. That is the final twist of the 1840s Great Reset. The fire did not simply erase the past, it taught power how to survive the erasure. And once that lesson was learned, it never really vanished. It only waited for the next fire, the next gap, and the next official truth built from the rubble.